Hi everyone, in this video we will introduce Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container applications. Docker Compose relies on a YAML configuration file. In the tutorial, we will use Docker Compose to run 3 different containers. The first container will utilize a Jupyter Notebook to retrieve stock data from a website. The second container will utilize MySQL for a database to store the data. The third container will run phpMyAdmin, a web service which we will use as a graphical user interface to view the stock data within MySQL. I am going to bring up my terminal. I am going to change directory into the directory named DC, where I will store all my relevant files in. Running code followed by a period will open Visual Studio Code in the current working directory. The first thing I am going to do is I am going to create my compose.yaml file. This is going to be necessary in order to use Docker Compose. I will name it compose.yaml. In our YAML file, we will have to define our services. A service is a specification of how to run a container. The first service we will define is for MySQL. At the top of my editor, I am going to type services, then I will work on defining the service for MySQL. Now I need to set my image for MySQL. On the next line, I will set the image as MySQL latest. This line will pull the MySQL Docker image from Docker Hub. For the next line, I will set the restart policy as always. There are other policies you can also set, but in my case, reset always is the ideal choice for me. If the container stops for any reason, the configuration will always attempt to restart the stopped container. This is useful if the application for the container crashes and it needs to be recovered by restarting the container. On this line, I am going to set my environment variable. I need to provide the password for the root MySQL user. It is good practice to set a password as an environment variable. I can set the MySQL password variable by editing the bashrc file in my terminal. If you are working with Mac, you would edit the zshrc file, and on Windows OS, you can use the set command to establish the environment variable. Now that I have it set in my compose file, I will bring up bashrc in my terminal. I am going to use the nano editor to do this, and I will type nano ~/.bashrc. I am going to scroll down to the bottom of the file. At the bottom, I will comment that the variables below are for my Docker builds. I will type export mysql_root_password, set that equal to the password, and then I will save and exit nano. Now that I've saved the file and exited, to restart and implement the variable, I will run source followed by ~/.bashrc. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Next, we will map the ports for MySQL. I am going to type in the host port first. By default, it is 3306, and the next port is the container port, which I will also set as 3306. Finally, I am going to set a volume for MySQL. A volume will allow the data stored and generated from a container to persist after the Docker engine shuts down. We have finished defining the MySQL service. Now we will move on to phpMyAdmin. phpMyAdmin is a graphical user interface that will allow us to interact with MySQL. Like before with the MySQL image, I am going to label the service as phpMyAdmin, and underneath I am going to pull down the latest phpMyAdmin from Docker Hub. I will again set the restart policy as always. For the port mapping, I am going to set it as 8080 for the host port to 80 on the container port. I won't set the host port to 80 because it is commonly used for the Internet Communication Protocol HTTP. This can cause conflicts on the host machine. We will now set the environment variables. We need to configure these so phpMyAdmin can properly connect to MySQL. The PMA host specifies the hostname phpMyAdmin will connect to. PMA port is the port number the MySQL application is listening to. The PMA user and PMA password set the user and password to connect to the server. Finally, we need to define the depends on option. phpMyAdmin relies on MySQL. We have now finished configuring phpMyAdmin within our compose file. The last service we will define is for Jupyter, which will allow us to create Jupyter notebooks and run them with programming languages such as Python. In my case, I need to customize the Jupyter service on top of the base image. What I will do is create a Docker file in my current directory to customize Jupyter further. For the Docker file name, I am going to capitalize the D, and the file does not need an extension defined. At the top of the Docker file, I am going to pull in the latest base Jupyter image from Docker Hub. Next, I am going to create a requirements text file which will install all of the necessary packages I will need to run my Jupyter Notebook. I have my Python packages defined. Let's go back to the Docker file. What I need to do is copy the requirements text file to a temporary folder within the Docker container. For the last line, I need to install the Python packages to use in my Jupyter Notebook with pip. I am going to use the no-cache-dir flag to download the newest Python packages in the requirements text file each time. Now that we have completed the Docker file, we can go back to the compose file. In the compose file, I will finish defining the Jupyter service. I will build the Docker file from the current directory. I will always restart the service. I will map both the host and container ports to 8888. Now I need to set the environment. I will enable Jupyter Lab, and I am also going to set a Jupyter token. Like we did before, I need to set the Jupyter token as an environment variable in my bashrc file. I will bring up my terminal again. I will run nano tilde /bashrc. At the bottom, under the MySQL password, I will set the Jupyter token. I will save and exit nano. And I will run source /bashrc to implement the environment variable. Let us go back to our compose file. To finish the Jupyter service, I also want to store any notebooks that are created in my container in a Docker volume, which I will define here. We have now finished defining our last service. For the last part of the compose file, I am going to set the volumes to store our data within MySQL and our Jupyter notebooks. Now we have completed our compose YAML file, and what we could do is try to actually run Docker Compose and run each of these services. I am going to bring up my terminal and type in docker compose up-d. This command will read the compose file, build the Docker images, and creates and starts the containers. The -d flag runs the containers in detached mode, and they are running in our background. Now that we built the images and are running the containers, we could double check that they are running with Docker PS. And we can see that all three services are running. I can now bring up my Jupyter Notebook in my web browser. In the search bar, I will search for localhost 8888, which is the port that we tied to the Jupyter Notebook. This brings up Jupyter. I am prompted to input the token to access Jupyter. And I am going to run a Jupyter Notebook using Python. I am going to fill in my Jupyter Notebook, and I'll fast forward, then I'll review the code within the notebook. We now have the Jupyter Notebook filled out. The first cell imports all the Python packages the code relies on. Next, we will call on yfinance to download 5 years of Apple stock data into a pandas data frame. We have the data downloaded, and we have the first 5 rows printed here. We need to input the MySQL connection details to connect the Jupyter Notebook to the MySQL database. I am prompted for the MySQL root user's password. I'll type it in here. In the last 2 cells, we will create the MySQL engine as well as the new database to upload our stock data. The last cell will write our data to MySQL. We receive an output from the last cell, which denotes the number of rows written to the MySQL database. Now that we have our data uploaded to MySQL, let us go to phpMyAdmin to view the data. In another tab in my web browser, I will search for localhost 8080. On the left side, we have all of our databases listed. I am going to bring up the StockDB database. We have the table that we created, my table. I will select it. We can see that we have our stock data here. The number of rows total 1,259 like we saw in the output, and we have all the various closing prices, dates, and volume numbers for the stock data for Apple. Let us go back to Visual Studio. I am going to bring up my terminal again. To stop all the Docker services, I can run docker compose down. We can see that the containers have been removed. I can also run docker ps to ensure that all the containers have been stopped. And we can see that we do not have any running containers. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope that this video was helpful. In the Jupyter Notebook, I included the documentation pages for all the relevant programs we work with. If you found the video helpful, feel free to like and subscribe. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, X, GitHub, Medium, and Odyssey. Thanks again everyone, and happy coding.